winter of 1853, the snow fell hard and dry across the pines of Black Hollow, coating the slate roofs of the seminary in silence so thick it seemed the world had forgotten how to breathe. Cold clawed through the stone walls, creeping into every dormitory crack. But within the chapel, warmth pulsed from a different source, a sound not of fire but of voices. 40 orphaned girls sat in pews with their backs straight and eyes forward, their breath barely visible in the chill as the new choir director stepped onto the altar. Mr. Alton Greaves moved like someone afraid to stir the air around him. Tall and precise, every button of his black wool coat fastened with care, his gloves removed finger by finger as though each action were a ritual. He had arrived 3 days earlier, alone, with a single trunk and an envelope of forged letters, but no one questioned his past. Not the bishop, not the caretakers, and certainly not the girls. Orphans do not ask for history when survival demands silence. His credentials, penned in graceful calligraphy, told of London training and cathedral commissions, but there was no record of where he'd served the year before. The name of the last seminary he directed had been removed from parish archives. No forwarding address, no mention of why it closed its doors in December with fresh grave mounds behind the bell tower. Greaves began rehearsals before sunrise, before the girls had eaten, when their voices were raw and unfiltered. He insisted it was the only time the soul could speak freely. He assigned each child a number, not a name, claiming names carried emotional interference. The youngest, just 7, was called 12. She shivered uncontrollably when she sang, not from cold but from something no one else seemed to feel. Greaves noticed. He watched her lips more closely than the others, tilting his head as though memorizing the tremble of her vowels. He believed emotion wasn't a flaw in music but a frequency, one that, if measured precisely, could replicate trauma. He told the girls their pain was not shameful but useful. That music required sacrifice, and beauty born of ease was hollow. He didn't shout or strike them. He didn't need to. His power came in the silence between notes, in the unbearable stillness he demanded before a hymn. He would pause for minutes, eyes closed, listening, not to them but to something inside himself. They feared those moments more than the songs, for when he opened his eyes, he would always choose one girl. Not for punishment, but for private tutoring. No one spoke of what happened in those sessions, but they returned with blisters behind their ears from tuning forks or voices that cracked on simple scales for days after. In the chapel, the acoustics sharpened even the smallest whisper. Greaves redesigned the space without approval, tearing down the velvet drapes and replacing them with thin reeds he claimed absorbed spiritual noise. He removed the crucifix, stating that suffering was sacred enough without symbols. He hung nothing in its place. Over time, the girls stopped humming in the halls. Their voices, once spontaneous, now waited for his command. At night, they didn't sleep easily. Some awoke to strange vibrations in the walls. One girl swore she heard her own voice humming back to her after rehearsal, as if it had been trapped in the chapel beams. Another claimed her dreams were no longer hers, that she was singing verses she didn't remember learning. Their bodies grew pale from the cold, their eyes hollow from exhaustion, but their harmony deepened, growing more precise with each session. Visitors from nearby towns began to whisper about it, calling the choir angelic, otherworldly. They came to hear them sing at vespers and left in tears, unable to explain why the melodies haunted them for days afterward. Some swore they heard names in the songs, names of the dead. Sister Marielle, the caretaker, wrote in her diary that the girls no longer cried, only blinked with eyes too large for their faces. She tried to intervene once, suggesting the girls should rest, but Greaves smiled and said the work of the soul cannot be delayed by hunger or fatigue. He offered her a composition titled The Lament of Unmarked Graves. When she opened the score, the pages were blank except for a single phrase scrawled in red. "Listen closer." That night her ears bled in her sleep. She told no one, and so rehearsals continued. Winter deepened. Snow drifted higher against the seminary walls, burying the windows until only thin light bled through the cracks. The chapel doors groaned with ice, but never locked. And every morning before the sun touched the steeple, the choir began again, 40 voices rising in eerie perfection, synchronized not just in sound but in breath, in tremor, in something no child should be able to fake. Greaves stood before them, eyes closed, hands raised, as if conducting not just music but something older, something buried in the cold ground of Black Hollow itself. The choir's voices rose like prayers, pure, aching, and strangely synchronized. At first, Sister Marielle dismissed the scratching she heard beneath the chapel floorboards as the normal settling of stone and timber in deep winter. The way old buildings creaked when they remembered their own weight. But when it continued, night after night, long after the girls had been sent to their beds and the candles snuffed down to quiet embers, she began to suspect something else. On the 7th night, with frost needling the corners of every window, she followed the sound through the back corridor, past the vestry, to the narrow spiral staircase that led to the undercroft. There, in the lowest room of the seminary, lit only by a single lantern and the glow of his own breath, sat Alton Greaves at a warped wooden table, hunched over a thick ledger. He did not look up. He didn't seem startled to see her. He kept writing with his left hand while holding a tuning fork in his right, striking it gently against the stone wall every few minutes as though timing the decay of the note with each line he inscribed. Marielle said nothing. She watched the pages move, not musical bars, not hymnals, but grids, columns of names, dates, single-letter notations, and a third column she could not decipher, full of numbers and key signatures that made no sense when read as music. She stepped closer and saw that one name had been crossed out, not erased, but scraped away so forcefully the page had torn. The name had once read Henley. Henley was the name of the school's gardener, an old man who'd worked there for 2 decades. 3 days prior, his body had been found near the riverbank with his tongue missing and his hands submerged in mud. The coroner blamed wolves for freezing injury. But the ledger had the date recorded 4 days before the death. Next to it, Greaves had written, "A minor, flat 6, no resolve." Marielle tried to speak, but Greaves tapped the tuning fork again and whispered something to himself about the importance of silence between measures. She stepped back. But that night her dreams were flooded with a sound she couldn't name, like a violin string tightening inside her ribcage. The next morning she returned to the undercroft. Greaves was gone, but the ledger was not. Its pages were covered in new entries, faster, more erratic. This time Marielle flipped to the beginning, expecting instructions or themes. Instead, she found the earliest entries. Names of children no longer at the seminary, marked missing or relocated in official records. Their notations followed patterns. G minor, D sharp, B diminished. All entries were followed by numbers. When she placed her hand on the parchment, she realized the ink was not black but a deep crimson, long dried. She told herself it was rust. She knew it wasn't. Days later, Marielle began tracking the names. She left the seminary grounds and visited the church in Hollow's End, then the burial records at the edge of Weir's Hollow. Each name was real. Each name matched a date. Each date led to a death. Drownings, disappearances, fires, always young, always quiet, always recorded in Greaves' hand before they happened. She brought this to the bishop's aide, a pious man with hollow eyes, who promised to look into it. 2 days later, his horse was found dead on the road and his home reduced to ash. No cause was given. No investigation followed. Greaves conducted choir practice the following morning with a new melody, slow and mournful as if in tribute. But Mariel saw his lips twitch upward with every descending note. She returned to the Undercroft once more and found the ledger open to a fresh page. Her own name was written at the top, followed by a date 5 days in the future. Her voice caught. She turned to flee but paused. Beneath her name were not musical notes but a single word repeated twice. Rest. Not arrest. Not rescue. Just rest. She tore the page out and hid it beneath her habit, then locked herself in the chapel overnight, praying without sleep. By morning, news came from the village. The Bell Foundry, home to the iron molds that cast the town's sacred chimes, had burnt to the ground. No cause, no lightning, no foul weather, just heat, then silence. 4 men were missing. 2 more were hospitalized with burns. Mariel returned to the ledger and found the foundry's name listed beneath a new date, 3 days before the fire. Key signature F minor. He had written beside it, collapse, reverb, echo for 7. She began to understand that these were not just prophecies. They were compositions. Greaves wasn't predicting tragedy, he was conducting it. He had found some link, some unholy correlation between vibration, intention, and outcome. The seminary was not his stage, it was his tuning chamber. And the girls? They weren't students, they were instruments. Trained not just to perform, but to resonate with frequencies he believed could tear the veil between sound and suffering. The ledger was not music, it was a score for orchestrated ruin. Her hands shook as she read on. Some entries were blank, left only with names and days. Others were scrawled with slashes and notes like dissonance too weak or soprano failed to fracture. She began to see which girls had vanished and which had simply stopped singing. Mariel knew she couldn't go to the authorities. They had been at the last recital and wept in the pews, moved by the beauty they could not explain. She couldn't burn the ledger. She had tried. The flame turned blue and hissed out the moment it touched the ink. Now she kept it hidden in a satchel beneath the floorboards, wrapped in salt-soaked cloth and cedar. Every night she waited for her date to arrive, and every morning she counted which girls still had a voice. When the village's Bell Foundry burnt down exactly as foreseen, her suspicion grew. But deeper still grew the terrible certainty that some music was not meant to be heard. And some conductors were never meant to be human. Alton Greaves did not believe in talent. He believed in response. To him, beauty and sound came not from training or purity, but from how the body trembled when it met fear. He called it resonant empathy. The theory that a soul nearing the edge of suffering vibrated with a rare, divine frequency. He began testing the girls one by one, not by pitch or range, but by how their bodies reacted to certain stimuli. He never touched them. He never shouted. That wasn't necessary. He would enter their practice chambers late at night, speak no louder than a whisper, and lean in with words that slid beneath the skin like ice water. Quiet suggestions about coffins, about locked doors, about never being found. Then he would wait. If their eyes widened, he noted the flutter of breath. If their throats clenched, he made a mark. But if they cried, not loudly, but with that breathless kind of sorrow that breaks before it forms, he reached for the tuning fork. He struck it gently on the wooden beam, held it to their sternum, and recorded the exact pitch their sobs created as it passed through flesh. Each girl was catalogued by how her fear sounded. He called these recordings emotional keys and assigned them names in his private notebook. Grief in D minor, terror in C sharp, and despair with a broken timbre. He claimed their sounds were not cries, but data. A living index of suffering in sound. These weren't auditions, they were diagnosed. And once a girl matched his pattern, when her sob aligned with the fork's resonance, He assigned her a solo, not in the chapel, in the basement, in a room sealed with pine resin and chalk markings behind the old furnace. There she would sing for hours, no melody. Just the long, aching hum of a note held just before breaking. Greaves would sit still in the dark, his eyes closed, transcribing each vibration like scripture. If the girl collapsed, he simply adjusted the pitch. If her voice cracked, he wrote "weak vessel" and moved on to another. He was not cruel for pleasure. He believed this was science. Worse, he believed it was sacred. To the rest of the seminary, he called these girls soloists. He praised them publicly. They were given extra bread, warmer quilts, and even new shoes. The others envied them, not understanding the cost. One girl, Clara, was selected 3 times in a week. By the 4th night, she stopped responding to her own name. She hummed even in her sleep, her voice fixed on a single harmonic interval. Sister Marielle found her one morning in the choir loft, lips split and blood on the rail, still singing into the frost. When asked why, she whispered that the note wasn't finished. Greaves merely nodded when informed, stating the chord required closure. He was pleased. To him, this meant the experiment was working. In his private study, he mounted strips of parchment on the wall, each labeled with a girl's birth name, key signature, and the emotional frequency that produced their most potent sob. Some were underlined, some were circled. A few had been crossed out entirely. These were not the ones who had misbehaved, but those whose pain no longer resonated. Either they had grown numb, or they had broken in silence. He discarded them without punishment, simply removing them from rehearsal. They faded into the background, left to observe as others were chosen. And still the choir sang. Their harmonies grew colder, more precise. The warmth once found in group hymns was replaced by something clinical. Voices that moved in lockstep, with no room for breath or tremor. Greaves began playing back their cries through hidden brass tubes embedded in the chapel walls. These subtle echoes blended into rehearsal, feeding back the girls' own pain without them realizing. He believed this created a loop, a ritual of sonic trauma that would deepen their emotional signatures and unlock a final resonance he had not yet captured. A sound not born of sorrow alone, but of synchronized fear. The notes from their throats, shaped by whispered horrors and sleepless nights, became part of his secret compositions. They were no longer children. They were instruments of grief, tuned, tested, and prepared for something no one outside the seminary could yet hear. Elsie had always been quiet, the kind of child who watched more than she spoke, her presence small even among the other orphaned girls at Black Hollow. At 11, she was delicate, barely more than a whisper in the hallways, with pale skin that bruised too easily and eyes that never seemed to rest on one place for long. But it wasn't until midwinter, when the frost gripped the windows hard enough to crack the panes, that Sister Marielle first heard her sing while asleep. It began as a low hum, almost like prayer, but then the words came, syllables no one at the seminary recognized. They weren't Latin or English. They didn't belong to any hymn, yet they carried rhythm and order as if someone else had written them long ago. Marielle knelt beside her that first night, clutching a rosary, certain it was a dream or fever. But Elsie's lips moved with precision. Her tone swelled and broke with grief no child should know. And when she opened her eyes the next morning, she remembered nothing. Greaves was informed, and rather than show concern, he asked what key she had sung in. That evening he visited her dormitory. He brought no comfort, no questions, only a wire recorder and his tuning fork. From then on, he sat silently beside her bed each night, waiting with paper and ink. He claimed her sleep was not hers, that she was a vessel, a passageway. He told no one what he heard, but in his private notes he called her Channel 1, and beside her name, he wrote the phrase "unfinished souls seeking harmonic resolution." On the fourth night, she began to weep while she sang. The notes twisted downward into a slow, choking rhythm. Her body trembled as if submerged, and as she sang, a lantern in the hallway shattered without being touched. The next morning, the village awoke to tragedy. A fisherman named Caleb was found face down in the bay, his boat tied to the dock, his mouth filled with salt water and blood. The coroner said it looked like drowning, but strange bruises around his neck suggested something else, something unseen. Sister Marielle later found the exact melody Elsie had sung that night recorded on Greaves' parchment. The same intervals, the same rising pitch before silence. Greaves called it Foreshadow Motif A. When she confronted him, he simply said Elsie was becoming useful, and that the living sometimes spoke for the dead when trained correctly. That week, he stopped allowing Elsie to sleep in the dormitory. He moved her to the old bell tower, away from the others. Her room was stripped of blankets and mirrors. The door was bolted from the outside. He told the staff it was for her safety, but the truth was simpler and far colder. Greaves locked her in not to protect her, but to protect his work. Elsie was no longer just a girl. She had become an echo chamber for something older than music, something that didn't sleep. The humming began just after dusk, low and metallic, like a mouthless voice trapped behind stone. Sister Marielle first heard it while collecting firewood near the edge of the grounds, the sound barely audible above the crunch of ice underfoot. She paused beside the old ice house, its door weather-beaten and sealed shut with rusted hinges no one had opened in years. The building had been abandoned since before she arrived at Black Hollow, its contents supposedly emptied and its use forgotten. But the humming didn't stop. It pulsed with rhythm, faintly rising and falling like a breath held too long. And something about it, its pitch, its intent, made her stomach turn cold before the wind even touched her skin. That night, long after the others had gone to sleep, she returned with a lantern and chisel. The door gave out after 3 strikes. The hinges cracked like bone. Inside, frost coated the walls like ash. And the smell was not rot, but something worse, something preserved. The humming had stopped, but in its place was a faint pressure in the air, the kind that builds before a scream. She stepped carefully across the stone floor, the light flickering against black scorch marks that climbed the walls in spirals. At the far end, a trapdoor sat flush against the ground. It hadn't been part of the original structure. The wood was newer. Etched into the surface were symbols she didn't recognize, sharp angles with no symmetry, carved with something too fine to be a knife. The trapdoor creaked as she opened it, and a warmth rushed upward that had no place in a frozen room. The stairs led to a chamber dug into the earth, lined with scorched copper panels and filled with the faint scent of varnish and iron. At the center stood a long table, wood darkened by time and stain. Above it hung rows of wire, each strung carefully with something pale, coiled and trembling gently in the warmth. It took her a moment to understand what they were. Vocal cords. Preserved in glass resin, still pink in places, their ends threaded and stretched like harp strings. Some were labeled with small tags, names she recognized, not just of students but of former choir directors, a midwife, and even the traveling piper who'd vanished last spring. Along the shelves were soot-marked tuning forks arranged by frequency, blackened embalming tools laid out with surgical precision, and pages of musical notation written not on paper, but on parchment so thin it looked translucent. When she held one to the light, she saw that it was skin. The ink bled along the pores. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The sound had been stolen from her throat by the weight of what she saw. But she gathered what she could, one vial, one sheet, one tag, and fled back into the night, Her hands trembled as she climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, as if the room were trying to pull her back, as if it didn't like being disturbed. She burst into Greaves' office, shaking, breathless, holding the evidence out before her like a torch. But he didn't flinch. He looked at the items, then at her, and calmly told her that music is eternal, even if the vessel perishes. Then he returned to his writing as though she had only interrupted a rehearsal. The storm came without warning, swallowing the hill in fog and sleet as winds screamed across the chapel's spire like something trying to claw its way in. Lightning struck the ground near the outer gate, and the earth shook with such force that dust poured from the rafters above the altar. The pews groaned as if mourning, the wood flexing under unseen weight. But it wasn't the wind or the rain that drew the villagers to the chapel doors that night. It was the sound. Deep, slow, and rhythmic, like a throat humming beneath the floorboards. At first it was faint, a low murmur rising through the cracks between the pews. Then it grew louder, moaning but not in pain. It was structured, layered, and carried with it the unmistakable shape of harmony. A chord built on intervals no one recognized, not grief, not reverence, something older, something that didn't ask to be heard. It simply was. Sister Marielle was the first to realize it wasn't coming from above. She knelt and pressed her ear to the floor. The vibration was there, steady and pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath the stone. She traced it aisle to aisle, pew to pew, and found that the pattern changed depending on where she listened. Each section of the chapel held a different part of the sound. Sopranos near the front, lower registers in the back, as if the building itself had become an instrument, playing something composed without a conductor. But that wasn't true. There was a conductor, and he stood at the far end of the nave, his hands folded calmly behind his back, eyes fixed not on the chaos but on the pulpit's base, where the tremors seemed to concentrate. Greaves said nothing as people panicked. He simply watched, and when someone demanded to know what was happening, he smiled faintly and whispered that old buildings breathe, that sometimes they sing. After the storm passed, when calm returned, workmen were called in to inspect the foundation. They removed the floorboards, expecting rot or flood damage. But what they uncovered left them pale and silent. Beneath the chapel, dug into the earth without any record or plan, was a vast chamber of tunnels, wind channels carved into the soil and stone, reinforced with bone, human bone, ribs stacked like latticework, femurs arranged into ducts, skulls hollowed and fitted with reed-like mouthpieces. At the center of it all, a massive wheel made of spine segments and brass gears turned slowly with the flow of air, creating the vibrations that had echoed above. It wasn't a flaw in the structure, it was the structure. A buried organ made not of pipe and wood, but of what had once lived. The girls who had vanished, the drifters who had gone missing near the seminary. Their parts are used not in cruelty, but in design. No one could explain how it had been built without sound, without record, without drawing notice. The workers refused to return. The bishop's men ordered the chamber sealed, but Greaves remained unmoved. When questioned, he said only that it had always been there, that he had simply tuned it, as if the chapel had waited its whole life for someone like him to find its true voice. He chose them carefully, 3 girls, all under 13, whose voices held a softness he called fragile resonance. He told the staff they were being prepared for a special recital, one that required deep focus and silence. But no one was permitted to witness the rehearsals. The girls were taken down into the cellar beneath the western wing, a space no longer used since the pipes froze there every winter. The entrance was hidden behind shelves of rotting hymnals, its stone door wedged shut with salt bricks and soot markings that even Sister Marielle could not translate. Inside, the walls were lined with vines, dead and brittle, woven into the cracks like veins under skin. Greaves called it the Cellar of Thorns and said it was chosen because silence lived longer underground. The girls were stripped of speech from the moment they entered. For 3 days they were forbidden to speak, hum, or even whisper. Greaves said the silence rewrote the mind, tuned it to subtler frequencies. They were denied warmth. At night they were submerged up to their necks in icy water pulled from a well sealed since the plague years. Their bodies shook, their breath shortened. Their skin turned purple where it should have been pale. But this was part of the design. Greaves monitored their pulse through a copper coil wrapped around their wrists, adjusting the intervals between immersions based on how long it took their hearts to settle. He believed oxygen starvation at precise stages of recovery opened something spiritual, like a window within the soul. He called it resonance realignment and told the girls they were not suffering, they were being sculpted. On the 4th night, the smallest girl, Lena, just 10, began to hum without realizing it. A trembling, high-pitched note escaped her as she sat in silence, her breath hitching as she tried to suppress it. Greaves stopped everything. He ordered the others to face the wall and not turn around, then approached her slowly with the tuning fork pressed against his chest. When he struck it, the vibration filled the room like a second heartbeat. Her hum matched it perfectly. He placed his hand over her mouth and the note still vibrated in the air after her lips had stopped moving. He smiled. That was the last time anyone saw Lena. The following morning, only 2 girls returned from the cellar. No explanation was given. When Sister Marielle demanded answers, Greaves stated flatly that Lena had fulfilled her purpose. He offered nobody, no burial, and no name in the register. But that night, as the choir resumed its practice upstairs, the recording bell captured something strange, a voice not present in the room, not standing among the living. A perfect, breathless note threaded beneath the harmony. Clear, steady, recognizable. It was Lena's voice, and it didn't tremble, it didn't waver. It had become something else entirely, something preserved. The first grave was found by accident, unearthed by the hooves of a spooked horse near the edge of the frost-bitten woodline behind the seminary. The shallow mound, once disguised beneath a layer of dead pine, collapsed inward to reveal the delicate remains of a young woman curled in on herself, her hands bound with choir ribbon, and her throat neatly opened from beneath the jaw. There was no rot, no scavenging, only precision. Her vocal cords had been removed cleanly with surgical control, and in their place, wrapped in cloth beside her ribs, was a small vial filled with resin. Suspended inside it, coiled and pale, were her preserved cords, stretched and lacquered like a saint's relic. Within days, 3 more graves were discovered, each identical, each missing only the part of the body that once made sound. Panic didn't spread quickly. It crept. Whispers moved faster than facts, and by the time the constable arrived, Greaves had already turned the narrative. He said the girls were victims of an old caretaker long gone. He said the site was cursed long before he came. He said the earth holds pain in strange ways. But Sister Marielle knew those graves were fresh. She knew the names of the girls. Some still listed as transferred. Others claimed to have returned to distant relatives who never existed. She gathered what she could, bones, ribbons, shards of hymnals buried in the same soil, and sent word to the bishop. For once, someone came. He arrived not with wrath, but with wine and gold-threaded robes. He listened to Marielle, he studied the graves. He walked the grounds with Greaves. And then he stopped asking questions. Days passed. No report was filed. No charges were made. The graves were recovered and the land was declared consecrated. When Mariel confronted him, he handed her a letter sealed with the church's crest, an order of silence disguised as prayer. That night, Greaves invited the bishop to a private performance. No choir, no audience, just one composition played on an organ no one had ever seen brought into the chapel. He called the piece Cantus Mortalis, the song of death foreseen. It was not melodic. It pulsed, it fractured, it climbed and dropped like a body falling through air. Greaves claimed it had come to him in sleep, that it was written not in ink, but in instinct. He handed the bishop the score, told him to study it carefully, and then escorted him out with a gentle nod. Weeks later, as snowfall swallowed the path to Hollow's End, news arrived from the city. The bishop had been assassinated, stabbed in broad daylight on the cathedral steps. The exact notes from the song Greaves played were found etched into the wood of the murder weapon, carved with something small and sharp. No one connected it publicly. No eulogy mentioned the seminary. But the whispers returned, sharper now. The Psalm of Broken Mothers, they called it. A warning wrapped in music. A hymn only the dead understood. And as for Greaves, he simply added another page to his ledger. One more entry. One more silence preserved. The composition had no title at first. For weeks, Greaves referred to it only as Sequence X, a label scrawled in the margins of his ledger beside frantic notations that grew sharper and more erratic with each day. The ink bled through the pages like wounds. He worked in silence, ears packed with wax to avoid distractions, refusing to eat or sleep until the final measures were complete. When it was done, he gave it a name no one dared speak aloud more than once, the sound of divine negation. He didn't teach it to the full choir. Only 7 girls were selected, each chosen for their tonal instability, the way their voices cracked under pressure or slipped between keys without intent. Greaves believed their imperfection made them sacred, that dissonance was closer to truth than harmony. He told them nothing of the piece's purpose, only that it must be performed exactly as written. No deviation. No breath uncounted. The performance took place at dusk, behind closed chapel doors. No audience, no clergy, just Greaves and the girls, standing in a perfect semicircle beneath the stained glass window of St. Cecilia, their mouths trembling as the first note pierced the air. It began slowly, unassuming, almost tender. But something inside the sound shifted. The notes did not follow normal intervals. They stretched in strange directions, forming chords that seemed to cancel each other out mid-air. Sister Mariel, listening from the hallway, clutched her chest without knowing why. Outside, the birds stopped flying. The wind died, then the first one fell. A sparrow, small and weightless, dropping to the snow with its wings still open. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the sky began to rain bodies. Down in the village, mothers screamed as their children collapsed mid-step, clutching their ears, blood trickling from their noses. Grown men staggered in the streets, disoriented, some vomiting, others weeping without knowing why. Dogs howled as if struck. Lamps burst without flame. All of it traced back to the chapel, where the sound continued, growing in force and density, folding in on itself like a tunnel with no exit. Inside, one of the girls fainted, her throat still vibrating even after she lost consciousness. Greaves smiled as he conducted, not with motion but with breath. Each inhale altered the pitch, each exhale extended the suffering. He believed this was what the old composers feared to write down. A score not meant to glorify God, but to erase his presence entirely. When the last note rang out, silence did not return. Instead, a thin, high-pitched frequency lingered, barely audible but impossible to ignore. It echoed in the bones, not the ears. The girls collapsed. Greaves lowered his hands. The air felt torn. The birds were gone, dozens dead. The village is shaken, and when asked what had happened, he merely tilted his head and said it was a rehearsal. Nothing more. A test. The real performance had not yet begun. It had been days since the last rehearsal. The choir was silent, the bells untouched, and the air inside the seminary held a strange stillness, as though the building itself had paused to listen for something unspeakable. Sister Marielle hadn't slept. Her hands trembled as she moved, her ears still ringing with that thin frequency that had clung to the walls since the sound of divine negation was first performed. She waited until Greaves was gone from his study, then entered with the key she had taken months before but never dared to use. His office was kept meticulously clean, no dust, no clutter, just a single desk, a locked cabinet, and the faint scent of oil and parchment. The windows were shut despite the growing heat. A sheet of music lay on the table, blank, except for one word written at the bottom in slanted ink. Listen. Her eyes drifted to the cabinet. She pried it open, breath shallow, expecting to find another ledger, more recordings, perhaps even another of the resin-bound cords she had seen buried beneath the ice house. But what she found was worse, because it had form. It had weight, and it had once breathed. Wrapped in silk and bound with red twine was a book, no bigger than a hymnal but heavier than it should have been. When she unwrapped it, she recoiled. The cover was not leather, it was skin, pale, smooth, with hair follicles still visible at the edges, stretched and cured like parchment but unmistakably human. Her stomach turned. She forced herself to open it. The first page had a staff line burnt into the flesh, not drawn, not inked, but branded. The edges of the stave bubbled slightly as if scorched into place, and on those lines, instead of notes, were tiny notations resembling surgical instructions, abbreviated Latin terms for pressure points, incisions, and breath modulation. Each page followed the same pattern: music fused with anatomy, sound mapped onto pain. The margins were filled with obsessive measurements: throat width, lung capacity, vocal fold tension, all paired with names. Mariel flipped through them with shaking fingers. She recognized nearly all. The girls who had vanished, the girls who had changed. One page had a faint pink stain across it, possibly blood, possibly something worse. At the bottom of that page was a crude drawing of a girl's mouth held open with hooks. Beneath it, the word silencio was carved with a needle. Greaves had not written music. He had harvested it. His obsession with resonance, with frequency and suffering had led him to believe that true harmony required living notation. This book wasn't theory. It was a manual: how to break a voice, how to preserve it, how to stretch it across time. It was a choir constructed one child at a time. Mariel stumbled back, bile in her throat, the hymnal slipping from her hands and landing open on the floor. One page fluttered. It bore a full staff, notes seared deep in a minor key, and below it the unmistakable outline of a human face, thin, mouth agape, eyes hollow. She fled. She ran to the hearth at the far end of the corridor where the fire still smoldered low, and she hurled the book into the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came the smell: flesh, hair, salt. The fire hissed violently, flaring upward as if rejecting what had been given to it. And then, without warning, screams echoed from above. 3 choir girls asleep in their beds began to convulse. Blood poured from their noses and ears. One girl's eyes rolled back while her throat vibrated with a note she wasn't singing. Mariel rushed to them, sobbing, helpless, knowing deep inside that the music had not been destroyed. It had merely been disturbed. The book burnt for 13 minutes before finally going still, but its contents had already left the page. The girls survived barely, but never spoke again. Their throats remained raw, their voices silent, and their eyes distant. And still in the walls of the seminary faint sounds echoed at night, Notes that matched no known scale, tones that pulsed with breath that no longer belonged to the living. Mariel kept the ashes, locking them in a lead box beneath her bed. She no longer believed she could stop him. But she knew now what she was dealing with. This wasn't music. This was a form of memory that fed on sound, that lingered long after the source was gone. And Greaves, he wasn't composing anymore. He was remembering something older than the song. The last concert was never announced, no invitation was sent, no parishioners were summoned, and no bishops traveled in for review. The pews remained empty that night, lit only by candlelight that flickered with a strange stillness. The storm outside was already building, wind scraping the chapel windows like claws testing the glass. Inside, Greaves stood before the 7 remaining girls, thin, pale, and trembling. Not from cold, but from what they had come to understand about him. They were dressed in white robes stitched with crimson thread, each note of his final composition sewn into the hem. He had spent weeks preparing for this night, whispering to them that the piece would be his final gift to the world. He called it Canticle for the Silence Beyond Silence, but the girls knew. This was not a farewell, it was a summoning. He raised his hands to begin, but the air did not shift the way it usually did. There was no sacred pause, no breath held across the room. Only eyes, 7 of them, staring back at him, unblinking. Their mouths opened, and the first note emerged, soft and haunting, just as he had written. But something was wrong. The pitch was altered just slightly, enough to displace the center of the harmony. He frowned and gestured again. The next note followed, but it bent around itself like a bone out of socket. The girls stood firm. They were not rebelling in rage. They were reshaping his music with surgical intent, each one choosing to unwrite him in the very language he believed only he could control. They leaned into dissonance, not by accident, but by design. It was not chaos. It was revenge wrapped in control. Greaves felt it first in his teeth, a buzzing sharp and unrelenting like a string tightening inside his jaw. Then his ears began to ring. The tuning fork he kept in his coat vibrated without being struck. He clutched it, confused, until the blood came. First a trickle, then a stream. His left eye was clouded with red. He staggered back, looking at the girls as if they had become something else entirely. The sound twisted again. One of the girls stepped forward, her voice climbing to a place beyond human range. The vibration shook the glass in the windows. Dust fell from the beams. Greaves screamed, but the sound was lost beneath the wave. His knees gave out. His mouth opened, but no sound came, only more blood. He clutched his ears, trying to silence what he himself had trained them to produce. He collapsed mid-conduct. His ledger, tucked beneath his podium, caught fire without flame. The candlelight dimmed to black. The girls held the final note together, unmoving until it dissolved into nothing. And then, in the stillness that followed, the building groaned, not from storm or wind, but from within. A soft cracking sound moved through the walls like breath being exhaled for the last time. The choir turned and walked away, not looking back as the chapel ceiling split along its spine and the steeple sank forward, groaning with the weight of something that had never belonged above ground. No cries came from within, no rescue was sent. Greaves did not scream again. He had become part of the silence he had worshipped. And the chapel, as if ashamed of what had lived in it, folded into itself and vanished into ash. Decades passed. The war came and went. New steeples rose in nearby towns and roads shifted with progress, bypassing the forgotten hill where Black Hollow once stood. The chapel was reduced to ruin. Charred beams, cracked stone, a hollow space swallowed by vines and moss. Locals spoke of it only in passing, calling it cursed ground, though most didn't know why. The girls who had survived left no legacy, and the church issued no records. Greaves were erased. His name was struck from all official documents and his compositions were never performed again. Time, it seemed, had buried the horror. But the earth does not forget what was done to it, and some music once made never truly ends. In the spring of 1892, a team of masons arrived to assess the chapel's remains for possible reconstruction. The initiative was led by a historical society eager to preserve the region's religious past, unaware of what had transpired in that place. They began digging, clearing collapsed stone and brittle timbers, cataloging what few artifacts remained. It was on the third day that one of them struck something beneath the chancel floor. Not stone, not soil, but brass. A panel, circular and fitted with strange grooves like a sun carved backward. It took hours to pry loose. Beneath it they found a staircase, spiraling, narrow and dry despite the decades of weather. The chamber below was perfectly preserved, airless, cold, not frozen but still as if untouched by time. At its center stood a massive organ, though it resembled no instrument the men had ever seen. It had no pipes, no bellows, no console. Instead, its body appeared to be formed from ribs, human, curved and polished, locked together with fused brass at the joints. The keys were made of bone, their edges worn smooth by use. Behind them were what looked like lungs, leather sacks, stitched crudely, inflated not by air but by silence. No one could determine how it functioned. No fuel, no wires, no mechanism. Yet at night, it played. At first the workers thought it was wind, but the sound was unmistakable, notes rising slowly then trembling downward, like a child sobbing into their own breath. One of the masons, a man who'd worked with instruments his whole life, swore the melody matched an archival recording he had once heard, an 1853 wax cylinder preserved by a university. The recording was labeled only "Unidentified Girl, Soprano Distress, Hollow Choir." The scream on the wax and the note from the organ were identical. Fear crept in slowly. Workers left. The society shut the project down. Reports were buried. But stories leaked out, stories of men who dreamt of singing girls with missing faces, of music etched into the walls of their skulls, of waking with dried blood in their ears after standing too long near the ruins. One night a child wandered from a nearby village and was found sitting at the organ days later, unharmed, smiling and humming a melody no one recognized. Her parents swore they'd never taught it to her. When asked where she'd learnt the tune, she answered softly, "It taught me itself." The ruins were sealed, fences erected, signs posted, but they didn't matter. People still came, not many, but enough. They stood in silence at the edge of the earth, waiting for the sound to rise again. And when it did, thin, broken, barely louder than breath, they listened. Some cried, some fainted, others returned night after night, unable to explain why. The seminary was officially declared off-limits by the church in 1894. But the breath of that organ still lingers in the hill's wind. No one knows who built it. No one knows who feeds it. But every note it plays matches a scream that was once recorded by a man who believed music could outlive the body. And now, even without him, it does. Each year when the leaves turn and the wind carries that low, aching whistle through the branches, the townspeople gather on the hill. They come quietly, without procession, without songs. There are no hymns sung at the memorial for the lost choir. Only silence. 13 names are etched into the stone that marks the edge of the former chapel grounds, though most of the bodies were never found. The townspeople place flowers, always white, always without stems, at the base of the plaque, careful never to step too close to where the floor once collapsed. Children are told not to speak while standing there. And if the wind rises, they leave, quickly. After the ruins were sealed, after the reports were buried and the earth allowed to swallow what remained, questions lingered. Too many to ignore. Musicians from across the region reported strange intervals slipping into their compositions, pitches they hadn't written and harmonies that echoed too long in the rafters. Some conductors claimed entire choirs fell out of tune when rehearsing certain notes, always in the same key signatures Greaves had once obsessed over. The church responded by issuing a quiet decree. All compositions performed in sacred spaces would now exclude specified frequencies and intervals deemed emotionally destabilizing or structurally unsound. They never admitted the reason, but the list was long and it included every key Greaves ever marked in his ledger. The local conservatory was instructed to destroy all surviving copies of his music. Most complied, but one professor, already dying, chose to donate his private collection to a sealed archive under the city library. There, years later, it would be discovered by a graduate student cataloging early American choral texts. Inside a leather-bound box marked only with the letter G was a confession. It had never been opened. Dated 4 days before the final performance, the document was written in Greaves's distinct hand. Clean, precise, unemotional. He detailed his belief that the soul had a frequency. Under conditions of trauma, grief or fear, that frequency could be isolated, recorded, and most dangerously, replicated. He wrote that the voice was not merely a tool of expression but a map of internal architecture. To alter it was to alter the self. To erase it was possible. He claimed he had never intended to kill, only to listen. That each child had offered something unique, that they became vessels for a sound he had once heard in a dream, long before he arrived at Black Hollow. He described the sound as a silence trying to remember its name. He believed pain, when ritualized, became structure, and that structure could be played like an instrument. He closed his letter not with remorse, but with instruction. Detailed measurements for how to build an organ from bone that would never need wind to breathe. The confession was never released to the public, but by then, it didn't matter. The consequences had already taken root. Teachers began avoiding choral pieces written before 1850. Vocal schools closed overnight when students reported persistent nosebleeds after practicing orphaned harmonies, melodies with no documented origin. Parents whispered about a new kind of illness, one that began with music and ended in silence. Churches replaced organs with string quartets. One cathedral removed its entire bell system after the tones began matching the cries of children who had never been inside its walls. The seminary was never rebuilt. The town erected no new chapel. No music has been heard from the ruins since, and yet, every now and then someone claims to hear it. Thin, distant, rising through the roots like a voice calling from deep underground. Always the same pitch, always that same sad chord. Some say the choir was cursed. Others believe it was punishment for trying to turn suffering into art. But the truth is quieter than either. The truth is, evil doesn't need to roar to be heard. It doesn't need to wear a mask or swing a blade. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it sings in perfect harmony, and sometimes it teaches others to sing with it. Greaves are gone. The girls are gone. The building is gone. But the frequencies still exist, scattered in the air, nestled in the echoes of places that once held sorrow, waiting. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or has it already started somewhere, with someone who's only listening, waiting for the note that never fades?